get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Barrera Ortega, and I'm the program specialist at the SGSO Network. And I'm so excited to have you today for our amazing webinar, A Taste of Indigenous Foods, featuring Mariah Gladstone, founder of IndigiKitchen. So before we get started, especially if this is the first time you're tuning in to SGSO Network program or webinar, just a very quick introduction. We are the School Garden Support Organization Network, and we're an open peer-to-peer learning network with the goal of growing, sustaining, and elevating a movement of equitable garden-based education. So we provide professional and leadership development, resources, and platforms for members to connect. And this is for folks that are providing programming from the school to district to regional to state to even national level. Some might even argue international too. So this is what our webinars are one of the ways in which we share expertise from members of our network for members of the network and provide many, it's a really great way to provide leadership for the network as well. So, and I love that the chat is still going off. So we're just gonna go through some general housekeeping as well as some announcements before we get into our amazing webinar of today. So our recording will be shared via email in our recording library and our website. So you will receive a recording of this webinar directly in your inbox by Friday, as well as it will live in our recording library so you can share with colleagues, share in trainings, use it as a resource as you might need to. So if you need to hop off, don't worry, you'll receive the rest and we'll be able to review it on your own time as well. I will be sharing some resources in the chat. And please, we encourage you to please share resources as we go. So if you see something that is that feels relevant, please drop it in the chat. I will be compiling them, and as a follow-up, we will send both the slides, resources that you're sharing, as well as any resources that Mariah might identify as useful. They will be also living with the recording on our website. So that will go to your inbox as well by Friday. Again, our webinars are 75 minutes long, so we will have an hour of content and then the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to continue to drop questions in the chat as they come up, or use the Q&A function in the control panel at the bottom of your screen. So drop them in, I will collect them, and then we will address them during the Q&A portion during the last 15 minutes. And we really want to hear your feedback. This is really important because we want to create content that feels relevant to you. We want to know how you're applying this content, and we also want to know what kinds of topics do you want to see in future webinar series as well. So I will touch upon this again during the last part of our presentation. But if you would like to keep the tab open for our feedback survey, the link will be shared in the chat shortly. Moving on to some general announcements. If you're excited to continue to connect with folks maybe that are in similar roles, similar types of organizations, similar regions, or folks that are of the same identity, we have peer learning communities. Going from a peer learning community, from this presentation to a peer learning community and bring this knowledge to them, I think would be really useful for them. So we have many, and the link to our peer learning community site will be dropped in the chat below shortly. And these are some examples of PLCs or affinity groups that might be relevant to today's topic that you might want to join. So we have an elementary, middle, and high school PLCs. Elementary has one, and middle and high have one together. We have a program managers and directors PLC. If you work at the statewide level in farm to school or supporting school garden networks, we have a statewide farm to school and school garden network leaders PLC, as well as if you work in a district office trying to incorporate Indigenous touch points at the district level. You could talk to the district level garden program PLC as well. This is just a sample of the full smattering of, I believe, 13 active PLCs we have. And also, if you see one that hasn't started yet around a topic, or you would like to begin an affinity group, please send an email to info@sgsonetwork.org so we can follow up with next steps on how we can make that happen. Another really great resource is our forum. So if you leave today wanting to connect with people about how they might be doing this kind of work, the SGSO Network Forum is a community of 1,085 members. Last time I checked, if it hasn't grown in the past couple of days, of highly engaged, really sharing expertise with each other, sharing resources with each other. This is the best way to really directly connect from members to members, share resources, exciting announcements, expertise, and learn how folks are doing different things. This is hosted in a Google group, so you do need a Gmail account to access the forum. But highly recommend, if you haven't, joining it. You can read more. There will be a link in the chat shortly as well. And the very last thing is today's webinar is our first in our current webinar series, focusing on Indigenous connections in school gardens. So our next webinar will be in May, and the title is Indigenous Connections from Classroom to Cafeteria from Wednesday, May 28th, 11 a.m. Pacific, 2 p.m. Eastern. The registration link will be shared in the chat below. And again, this is how featuring Hardin School District in Montana and how they're doing really amazing work and incorporating and really reflecting ancestral knowledge from their curriculum to their cafeteria to their community engagement opportunities as well. Whew, sorry, that was really exciting stuff coming up. And again, that's enough from me. Thank you all so much, and please help me welcoming an amazing presenter of today, Mariah Gladstone. Take it away.
Okay, nisto na tano ko omak kes tawakaki, no paktutu sitsikitsita pisachum. Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Gladstone, and I'm the founder of IndigiKitchen. I am both Blackfeet on my dad's side and Cherokee on my mom's side. And I'm super excited to be here with you guys today. You'll have to excuse some background noise because I had to check out of a hotel room and find a spot. And so I'm kind of in a busy business center right now in Seattle. So it's fun. But I am going to share my screen so that we can kick things off, and then we'll have about an hour-long presentation, kind of storytelling, but I will also watch the chat and Q&A as questions come up, or if Daniel, if you want to chime in, if you see a question and I'm just rambling, if it is also relevant to the moment, I'm happy to answer that, but we will have some allotted time at the end specifically for questions. So if you guys are thinking of something and you're worried you're going to forget it, drop it in the chat. We can get to it later, and we will figure that out. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And, oh, give me a second because I kicked things off, but I didn't share what I needed to. There we go. All right. You guys able to see the screen? I think so. Probably.
Yeah, we got
Why it wouldn't work. Okay. Perfect. So we're gonna jump into this. Also I was looking at the participants as they were coming up, and I saw my friend Bidabin Reinhardt, who may recognize where this cover photo came from because it was at a potluck that we were both at. And I shamelessly stole a picture of someone else's food for this image. So I'm going to be talking a lot about kind of the history of Indigenous foods and why it's so important to reconnect with those foods. And of course, to be able to figure out how to incorporate those lessons into the work that we're doing both in and outside the classroom and into the everyday lives of the kids that we're working with. So I want to be able to share that. Oh, and I broke this. Hold on one second. Shared something and then I just exited out because I hit the wrong button when I was trying to minimize my own face. All right, trying this again. Minimize my own face. Okay, so we're going to jump in with a brief history lesson, and this will kind of ground us in the space that we're at today so that we have a better kind of context for what we're getting into. But when the United States was about 2 years old, Major General Sullivan wrote orders to march against the Haudenosaunee, or George Washington, the first president, wrote orders to Major General Sullivan to march against the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And he wrote very clearly in those orders that not only should Major General Sullivan target the people and the villages, but it will be essential to ruin their crops now in the ground and prevent them from planting more. He explicitly ordered the targeting of the fields of corn, the storehouses that they had of food, and of course, the seed banks and the gardens, so that people would not be able to feed themselves in that following year. And this strategy of targeting Native people through food systems continued to be employed across the continent. It was, of course, in the 1850 Commissioner of Indian Affairs report that wrote, "It is cheaper in the end to feed the whole flock for a year than to fight them for a week." Essentially saying, if the US government, I'll also mention the Canadian government did similar actions, but if the US government can force Native peoples to depend on government subsidized food systems, then it will restrict their ability to fight back in open combat or to resist waves of settlers. And so food in this way was used as a tool of control. But of course, to force people to depend on you for food, you have to take away their ability to feed themselves. And so this was a huge motivating factor for the massive destruction of buffalo persons from the plains. Of course, you guys have probably seen this image at one point or another, which says, I put it next to a quote from a railroad conductor at the time, which says, "It is a mercy they can't eat bones. We were never able to control the savages until their food supply was cut off." And what's interesting to me about this picture, and which may tie into the work that you guys do, is, of course, well, this is, a dramatic representation of the loss of buffalo lives on the prairie. You guys also probably recognize that many times buffalo were killed, but they were not often used for food, right? A lot of the times the meat was left there to rot and be picked clean by scavengers. Sometimes the hides were taken from those buffalo, and this was in part because it was the start of the Industrial Revolution, and bison hides were some of the most durable machine belts at the time, which made for a effective machine belt before they were using vulcanized rubber and things of the sort. The rest of the animals were left on the prairies. And so later they actually paid Native people a couple of pennies essentially to go and pick up as many bones as they could and haul them to shipping locations. And it was here where they were stacked up, and we have images like this. These bones were then ground down to be used to make bone china, as well as a filler in gunpowder. So there would be open spaces and the gunpowder would be able to combust properly. And also the most common usage was actually fertilizer, to be used as bone meal to incorporate into the soil. And I think this is interesting because, of course, on a surface level, this image speaks to a massive loss of bison from the prairies, nearly to extinction. But also, looking beyond that, we also see that this ties into the loss of soil fertility and the decimation of topsoil health on prairies after only a generation or so of tilling on the plains. So this is kind of interesting because both that tilling and monoculture cropping was already starting to have a very severe effect on the quality of the soil health. So I tried to make you guys a graph, and this is like the hardest numbers to graph, so I apologize for its illegibility. But this demonstrates low-end estimates of what bison numbers were on the plains prior to settler contact. And the low end of that is about 30 million. If you are looking at the higher end estimates, that's closer to 60 million, sometimes as high as 75 million, but that would have made this graph worse. So we're sticking with the low end estimates. And by the time where I live, Montana became a state in 1889, that number had dropped to less than 1,000 buffalo total alive. And then, of course, there were large-scale conservation efforts and restoration efforts, both by government entities like National Bison Range, but also private entities. Actually, interestingly enough, Ted Turner has a large role in bison recovery efforts on the plains, and then, of course, tribal herds as well. So it's a combination of partners in that space that have worked on restoring bison populations. And now there is about 500,000 bison total, so they're no longer in danger of extinction. But of course, that is still far, far cry from even the low end estimates of 30 million. So as you can imagine, when you see the numbers of these animals on the prairies plummet so dramatically, You also see that indigenous nations that depended on bison for food, clothing, shelter, tools, footwear, ceremony, everything, had to find alternative ways to survive. And of course, the ultimate plan that the US government put out was realized in that they began instituting a ration program. And these are weekly ration cards that were issued to families, head of household. And once a week, the person in the family would go and pick up ration cards, and they would go and get a certain number, or so they would take their ration cards, get a hole punch, and then they would pick up a certain amount of rations based on how many people were in the homes. So this obviously caused a dramatic shift just in the contents of what people were eating, because these weren't traditional foods, or they weren't indigenous foods, but rather they were foods that were designed to be cheaply produced and shelf stable, transported over long distances, things like that, and to keep people from starvation. And so this was really the beginning of a massive shift in dietary contents and what people were actually consuming. The ration program switched eventually, and the commodity food program was started in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression. The commodity food program still exists on reservations. It's called Food Distribution Program on Indian Reservations, or FDIPR, which is, of course, still boxes of relatively shelf-stable food. They, of course, have a little bit more diversity within those boxes that are still distributed as part of the emergency food supply system, subsidized foods. But now there's a little bit more flexibility, and some of those offices within the FDIPR programs have actually started incorporating traditional foods as well, like wild rice or blue corn or buffalo meat, depending on where they are. So I won't say that just because it exists is necessarily quite the same as rations. And then also other forms of subsidized food programs like SNAP and WIC and other things like that. The last thing I wanted to address is just the shift of how community mindsets were shifted. And one of the big things that had an influence on this was the Dawes Act, which was kind of like the Homestead Act of Indian country. It divided up reservation lands, which inside the borders of a reservation were originally held in commons as a community by that nation. And in an effort to quote unquote civilize Native people, the Dawes Act was passed, which divided those lands into individual 160-acre parcels, and each family or head of household was essentially allotted an allotment, and they were told to get food from that land, become farmers and ranchers. And the mindset shift that occurred was not just the goal of the US government was to quote unquote civilize people by turning them into farmers and ranchers. But what really happened was people did not all have the same resources, right? In terms of the land quality, in terms of soil fertility, or access to animals or fish or plants or anything is not identical. And while you can get a lot of food from 160 acres, those 160 acres are not necessarily all adjoining. And in places with short season climates, farming is challenging, or in places with challenging winters, it can be difficult to raise livestock or navigate bear season, as I've been finding out during calving season lately. But it is definitely a challenge. And also this community mindset shifted. We went from living in villages and communities and taking care of one another as a collective, whereas even within farming indigenous communities, there was still shared labor and resources amongst the community, and now it has shifted to just nuclear families. So this really shifted the entire way people thought about food systems. So it was a massive shift within that. So I want to switch gears now and start talking about restoring a lot of these systems, but I wanted to frame this all within this context of what work has been done very intentionally to disconnect Native people from our foods, so that we are in this predicament where there are, of course, really high rates of obesity and diabetes and malnutrition, other diet-related illnesses as well. But also, of course, similar issues within that space. There's, of course, this disconnect from our cultural foods, a lack of knowledge about how to recognize the plants that we harvest, how to field dress deer, other things like that. So I'm putting all of that in the context of not just here is the result, but here is the system that led us to that result. But there's also a lot of really exciting work that's being done to restore those things as well. So within this Indigenous food system model, I like this graph. I also think that a lot of people put medicine wheels on things, and they're not always relevant. In this case, I think it is. But this is a graphic from North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. It's a nonprofit based out of Minneapolis, but they just opened up a food lab in Bozeman as well. So they have a couple different hubs for teaching about Indigenous foods. You can find this graphic on their website at natives.org. But this is cool because it breaks down food systems into more than just plants and animals, right? This is, of course, also the resources of the environment and the stories that go along with all of these foods as well. So we look at not just the resources of what foods do we have, what plants can grow here, things like that. We look at what time of year do you harvest these plants? What part of the plant do you use? How many can you sustainably harvest? How do you preserve those things? How do you cook with those things? How do you breed those plants to have the characteristics that you most enjoy? Sunflowers, of course, are a prime example of Indigenous knowledge where wild sunflowers were selected for larger and larger seeds as Indigenous people cultivated them until they're eventually the large mammoth sunflowers that we raise for seeds today. Similarly, of course, animals, you look at what time of the year do you harvest animals? How do you cut meat so that it is food safe? How do you preserve that meat? How do you utilize every part of that animal, including, sustainably and cleanly skinning that animal so you're able to use it for moccasins and clothing or teepees or anything else? How do you render the fats from that animal so you can use that for other things, for cooking oil, for any of that? But also the processes of hunting and fishing and, you know, working in that space. And then, of course, the elements. And I like thinking of this quadrant because it helps us start to think about the resources in our environments. And those resources include things like our climate, right? So in Montana, where I live, we have relatively dry air. We have long, hot summers, and even in the wintertime, it'll snow, but it is very, very dry. And we utilize that low humidity as a resource because it enables us to air dry and wind dry so many of our foods. When I make dry meat and I preserve elk from hunting season, if I run out of freezer space, I will start thinly cutting slices of meat and I will hang that on strings on the ceiling above my wood stove. And that basically turns it into a giant dehydrator because it's nice and hot on the ceiling. There's enough air movement that it dehydrates that meat. And I can make dry meat, kind of like a drier version of jerky, where the water is gone from the meat and it is totally food safe. And I'm able to do that because of the specific climate that I live in. But there's other ways that people do things. I went to grad school in upstate New York where it is incredibly humid, even into the fall. The air can stay very humid. And there's also a lot of hardwoods. And so a lot of smoking techniques for preservation were developed there. And a lot of salt deposits are there. So salt drying is a technique for preserving and curing food. So similar things like that, the types of rocks that people have and the geology of an area can be really useful for knife making, for making arrowheads, things like that, for gathering clay to make pottery, to work with that. Cooking rocks, of course, there's certain things that are useful. You can think about the climate zone and the ways in which certain swings between the freezing point of water in between day and night can be used as a food preservation technique. So I think of potato systems in the Andes and how people would preserve potatoes. Potatoes have a relatively long shelf life if they're stored correctly, but if you need to pack them to travel, they're incredibly heavy and it doesn't help you very often. And so people in the Andes developed a way of preserving potatoes that would utilize that specific climate at the time that potatoes were harvested, which of course is when it's freezing during the nighttime, but thawed out during the day. And people would smash the potatoes, essentially pressing them flat so that the water would smush out of them. And then they would leave them in big kind of lots of surface area spaces. And then at night, that water that had been smushed out of them would freeze into a solid, which made it very easy to go and pick pieces of ice the next morning off of those potatoes. And then you smush more water out of them the next day until you're essentially ending up with freeze-dried potatoes. In Spanish, it's called papa seca, which is just dried potato. But it's basically like a method of making almost like a potato, like instant mashed potato situation, that can then be, of course, transported as a very lightweight, incredibly shelf-stable food that was very efficient for the types of running message systems and basically the moccasin telegraph system that existed across the Andes. And so it made for very important fuel for people in that sense. And then, of course, there's things like indigenous wisdom. And of course, the preservation techniques are part of that. That kind of plays into both elements and preservation, but also the stories, the stories of where these foods came from, cooking techniques, all of that. The utilization of other parts of food related animals. So of course the hides, even though we weren't eating that was food related. How do we hide tan? How do we smoke those hides for preservation, utilize porcupine quills for decoration, everything like that. So lots and lots of connected things, and you guys can dive in and start unraveling about a million different stories in each one of these quadrants. And so there's a lot here, but it gets you thinking about food systems as more than just the ingredients themselves, but also all of these little webs that they're connected to. So I am looking at this real quick. Beautiful. Cool. Awesome. Okay. So let's dive into some of these stories. If I can get my slides to advance, that would be great. Okay, there we go. So as an academic, I, of course, appreciate a good peer-reviewed study. And as a Blackfeet person, I kind of scoff at them and I say, why should I need peer-reviewed studies to show 14,000 years of empirical data? So I love-hate relationships with this, but I am going to show you guys a peer-reviewed study. And this was done down at the Konza Prairie Biological Station in Kansas, where there's old growth prairie. So this is some of the untilled prairie that is incredibly rare that exists on the Great Plains. And in this study, there were 3 test plots that were divided up. And these test plots were basically broken down into a test plot where no mega grazers were allowed. The next test plot was where mega grazers, cattle essentially, were allowed to graze during the growing season. And that's because cows don't graze very well during the winter months. They do not have built-in snow plows on their backs like bison do. And then the third test plot, they had bison that were allowed to graze year round, just the bison. And then they studied these herds and the lands that they were on for 30 years. And what they found was that having cows and bison on those test plots more than doubled the number of, or the biodiversity of the native plant species that were on these tall grass prairie ecosystems. So really, really cool. So in contrast to what people kind of thought would happen, whereas, the plants weren't being eaten over here on this test plot, they thought that it would cause it to really flourish. But instead, what they found was that grazing had a much more positive effect on the health of the prairie than the test plot that was left alone. Bison, even to a greater extent than cows. And when they looked at them anecdotally, what they found was that the bison were more selective about choosing the more dominant species, which were the grass species themselves. And so they would go after those and avoid some of the other foliage and other types of herbaceous plants, whereas the cows kind of just kept their head down and grazed whatever. Plus bison do this really cool thing where they wallow. So they roll around on the ground, they create these big patches of basically they tear up the plant life in this specific area. But what it does is it also creates micro ecosystems where plant species are able to regenerate, and they rely on those bare patches of dirt for their seeds to germinate and to create new plants. So by doing this, they actually create very specific habitats for the plant species that have co-evolved with them. There's also certain plant species that will germinate much better once their seeds have passed through the digestive system of these bovine species. And also, studies during this time period also found that there's enzymes in bovine saliva, both cows and bison, that will stimulate the growth of the grass species. So when the grasses are grazed by these animals, they actually grow faster after being grazed. So cool things happening. But overall, the moral of the story is that grazing animals on the prairies are good for the health of the landscape. And if you don't have bison that are able to graze, incorporating cows that are able to graze can have a positive effect on the biodiversity of those lands as well. So some cool things happening with the research. Give me a second. Take a drink of this boxed water, I guess. All right, so I wanted to talk a little bit about mycology because I think that there's also some cool opportunities to talk about the differences between plants and animals and fungi, and to kind of connect with something outside the realm of just, plants in the garden, which is often what we're talking about. But there's actually a lot of cool ways that you can incorporate growing fungi in your garden systems. And they're super different from growing plants. You don't have seeds, but rather you have to inoculate some kind of substrate that the mushrooms can grow on. And so there's some cool ways to do this. And there's also cool ways to incorporate mushrooms, because you can put a block of substrate that's already been inoculated in your classroom itself and have kids spray the mushrooms and they can grow, and you can talk about different species. So this is a Blackfeet story that comes to us, and it actually tells the story of an earth woman that married a sky person, and she went to live with him in Sky World, and they had a little baby together, but she eventually became very homesick and she missed her parents. She wanted to uh, show her parents their new grandchild, and so she wanted to go back down to earth. And the sky man that she was married was a good man. He was very understanding, and he said, of course you can go back down to earth, but when you bring the baby with you, you have to know that he can't touch the ground for 7 days because he's half sky person. But at the end of that 7 days, he'll be able to walk around, or he'll be able to live just like any other earth boy. And this baby was very, very young. He was only able to maybe crawl on a good day. But she brought this baby with them down to earth, and when she got down, of course, she greeted family and she started back in her routine with her family. And she had this baby laying on a buffalo robe within the lodge itself. And she went outside briefly on the 6th day to gather some firewood to keep the fire going. But when she came back into the lodge, the baby had rolled over off of the buffalo robe and touched the ground, and he had transformed into a puffball mushroom. So these stories of how we ended up with puffball mushrooms actually comes from this very odd story of an earth sky relationship. And it is a reminder to keep an eye on your kids. But also sometimes in Blackfeet Lodge designs, you will see this circle depiction on the bottom. The round red part on this lodge design, this Blackfeet teepee design, depicts hills, but those round circles in white depict puffball mushrooms. And you will also see those same circles depicted above on the top part of the teepee in the sky as constellations. So it represents both puffball mushrooms on the ground, but also the constellations and the sky beings as well in the stars. So kind of a connection between earth and sky. And then, of course, I know that you guys know about the three sisters. And of course, like the OG polyculture of indigenous planting. And if you work in indigenous food systems at all, somebody tells you about the three sisters, which is of course referring to corn, beans, and squash. Corn grows tall and straight. Beans hang on to corn. They use it as a trellis, but beans are also a legume. So they have root nodules, which contain nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which pull the nitrogen out of the air and put it into the soil. So they fertilize the system. And then squash, like zucchini or pumpkins or other types of squash, spreads out on the ground. It prevents evaporative loss from the soil, but it also shades the ground and prevents some of the competitor weeds from getting enough sunlight to be able to grow. So they work really well together, but also they form a complete protein when eaten. And it's cool to talk about the three sisters because it can also be used as a metaphor in the classroom for how students that are very, very different can have different strengths and weaknesses, but they can learn to rely on each other for those and to support each other in those strengths and weaknesses. You know, you might not be able to stand up straight and you need someone else to hang on to, but you're fertilizing the system. Whatever that may be, you can use that as a metaphor for how we interact in jobs or family relationships or school or whatever that may be. So I think this is also, you know, there's lots of cool lessons and things that you can do cooking with the three sisters. But there's a couple related concepts as well that I wanted to talk about. And one of those is actually this idea of corn as this massive feeder of so many things. We had, of course, several civilizations on North America and Central America and South America that were, of course, corn-based. And that means not that people were eating tons of sweet corn, but rather sweet corn would occasionally be eaten during green corn ceremony. And then the rest of the corn was left on the stalks for that sugar that's in the sweet corn to have enough time to fully mature into starches. And then, of course, those husks would be braided and dried out to be preserved as dried corn. So now we're looking at more of this flint corn. If you guys have ever worked with dried corn, it is incredibly hard. It is incredibly difficult to work with because it's so hard. You can't just eat dried corn. It has to go through a process in order to be consumable. And if you have the ability to grind dry corn, you are probably beating up a grinder quite a bit, right? Because dried corn is incredibly hard. So if you grind it up, it turns into cornmeal. And cornmeal is, like sweet corn, not very digestible to our bodies. There's just a lot of nutrients that are still bound up in forms that are not absorbable to us. And we can, of course, make it into polenta if we cook it down like that, but you're not getting the nutrients out of it. So Native people developed a technique. We call this nixtamalization or nixtamalization. It comes from the Aztec language, so that X technically makes a sh noise. But it is the process of turning dried corn into hominy. And now we have to think acids and bases because the way that we do that is to add something, some type of something to a water bath in order to raise the pH. So traditionally this was done with wood ashes. The types of wood ashes depended on which peoples you're looking at. Now it is often done with culinary lime, but the idea is the same. You are raising the pH of the system into highly alkaline, high pH, very basic, so the opposite of an acid. And then you cook your corn within that water bath of high alkalinity. Sometimes this is called lying the corn because you're creating a lye solution, essentially. And it chemically removes the hull of the corn and it turns the bound niacin into a free niacin. It also adds calcium to the mixture. If you're using wood ashes, it adds a lovely smoky flavor. But it makes the corn way more digestible. So you're actually able to absorb the nutrients in this. So if you have that corn that has been processed, nixtamalized into hominy, you can of course eat that hominy in soup and things like that, or you can grind it up. A coarse grind is then called grits. A fine grind is called masa or corn flour, and you can make different breads with that, or tortillas or tamales or things like that. So it is this process that makes the corn more digestible. So all of this connects to my story, which is essentially that corn got brought back to Europe. Columbus brought some back, but it wasn't really widely adopted in Europe until later on in the late 1500s. where a lot of peasant communities in Eastern Europe, Italy, and Spain, actually also Egypt, started consuming a lot of corn, which was interesting. But because they had big milling technology, big technology where they were able to grind up the corn, the same as they ground up wheat flour or barley with water-powered and wind-powered mills, they were just eating it as cornmeal. So they were baking it into breads and they were making it into polenta and things like that, but they weren't getting the nutrients out of it. Specifically, they were not getting the niacin that their bodies needed. And so we start seeing huge epidemics of pellagra, which is a niacin deficiency, across Eastern Europe and Italy and Spain and Egypt. And this is because a lot of peasants, which were eating primarily grain-based diets, weren't getting this important nutrient in their bodies. One of the huge symptoms of pellagra is your skin will be super photosensitive to UV rays. And so you'll step out in the sun and it looks like your whole skin is just burning. And so if you have pellagra, you tend to avoid the sun. And so now these peasants are avoiding the sun, and if they go in the sun, they burn. And this is also where we start to see the origination of vampire mythology is from this time period. And so it's all connected to indigenous foods, but not necessarily the indigenous knowledge of how to eat those foods. And we end up with vampires. So it's not spooky season, but it's always spooky season. Happy spooky season to you guys. So we'll dive into this. This is another example of indigenous foods that require that knowledge in order to work with them. So these are camas, and if you do work anywhere around the Pacific Northwest or the Rockies, you may recognize camas. It's a beautiful blue flower, and it's been eaten by indigenous peoples for millennia, but it's a wild root vegetable. And so you have to know when to harvest it. People have different protocols depending on the tribe for when they harvest. Blackfeet people would wait until after they go to seed because then the nutrients go back into the soil. But it's a blue flower, and if you don't know your plant identification and you wait until it goes to seed, there's a chance that you can mistake it for death camas, which is a white flower, very hard to confuse when they're blooming, but can be difficult in with questionable plant identification knowledge. So some people harvest when it's blooming just for food safety, but then the roots themselves are very high in inulin. Inulin is also a compound that sunchokes or Jerusalem artichokes are very high in, and they require roasting or cooking for a long period of time in order to convert that inulin into digestible sugars, essentially. Traditionally, this was done in a pit roast, like you see in the picture. This picture was done in Oregon, and they did a great big pit roast where people would watch camas bulbs roast essentially like a big old crock pot for 2 days. And that would end up turning this flavorless, pretty indigestible bulb into something that is kind of like a cross between a chestnut and a sweet potato. Like it's a very sweet, delicious root vegetable. And then, of course, if you are cooking this for the whole village, you have a massive pit roast and you have all of the community help in order to do this. You can also do something very similar by putting these camas bulbs in a colander in a crock pot and letting them steam with a little bit of water in the bottom of that crock pot for about 2.5 days. So you can break this process down and do it in a couple other ways. Potentially in a classroom space. The other thing, if you don't live in camas country and you don't want to dig up things that might potentially be poisonous, sunchokes are another indigenous root vegetable that's really similar to this. Sunchokes are related to sunflowers, but they have been cultivated over time for having big edible roots rather than big edible seeds. So just different characteristics that were selected for. Sunchokes, as I mentioned, are also called Jerusalem artichokes, even though they're an indigenous food. And the reason they're called that is actually because the first non-native person that named them, I don't know the full name actually, but it involved the word girasol, which is, of course, faces the sun, because they're sunflowers. They do have little flowers that follow the sun. And an English speaker heard a Spanish speaker saying girasol and heard yaya Jerusalem. And then they named these things Jerusalem artichokes, which is wild to me. Anyway, they are also high in inulin, so they're really easy to grow sunchokes in a garden space, they have a tendency of taking over. So a nice contained raised bed is helpful for that. But it's a way of processing these root vegetables. And then going through the process, you can boil them first and then roast them, which is how I will process them. And they're a little bit easier to work with than CAMS, but still you get to talk about some of the same things. It's something that's really easy for folks to grow. And, things within the sunflower family are sometimes even referred to as the fourth sister, whether they're true sunflowers that we grow for seeds or beautiful appearances, or whether they're sunchokes. And that's because they were raised alongside the other plants, but not in the same mound. They're a great border plant because all things within this Helianthus genus emit herbicides through their root systems. It's called allelopathy, which basically means that they kind of poison the soil for other plants. So if you plant them in the mound, they will kill off your other plants, which is unhelpful. They're kind of the sister that doesn't really get along with everybody, but she's a great guard sister. She hangs out on the outside as a good border plant. She prevents other like weeds from getting into the garden. And also with those big flowers, they attract pollinators to the system as well. So it's a chance to talk a little bit about the fourth sister. Whether you're raising sunchokes or sunflowers, those can all be talked about as part of this. That's a lot of information. Oh, I forgot to tell you guys, I got to do a cool camas pit roast using some high school kids as labor because high school students on trail crew in the middle of summer love staying up all night and babysitting little pits of hot coals. So we got to do this. I will say Jerusalem artichokes have a nickname fartichokes, and camas is very much the same way. These boys ask if they could try a raw bulb, which is of course still in that very indigestible format. And these boys definitely kept themselves awake with the loud noises all night. So we had fun doing this pit roast. But this is what the camas looks like after it's gone to seed. So you guys can see that as well. Just hopping in the chat to make sure that I am not missing anything important. Okay, beautiful.
Yeah, go.
Also, yes, so cute. The graphic with the kids.
I'm
and
keeping an eye
first
on the
grade.
chat, so I got
Oh,
you.
okay, cool. No, I was just seeing that someone said that a first grader said, I am squash. I often, especially when I'm working with groups of young kids, will make kids kind of act out the three sisters and that method of planting. So some kid is corn and stands tall and straight, and then beans hang onto corn and just give corn a big hug. And then squashes are just like laid out flat on the ground all around. And it's a good way of kind of demonstrating how those plants are very physically different, but they work together and they help each other out. They're all part of the same system and community. So, yes, I am squash. All right. Advancing this. And there's also examples of other methods of working with indigenous foods, like choke cherries, for example. And I put this up here because obviously the NRCS has amazing resources. And also there's this great big red this red warning, parts of this plant can be poisonous. And yeah, that's true. The seeds of the plant do contain hydrocyanic acid, which is fun. It is essentially cyanide. But native people that consumed choke cherries actually took the seeds whole, pounded them into a pulp, and then dehydrated that pulp into basically like a fruit leather with chunks of pit in them. The dehydration process neutralized the cyanide, but left that lovely almond-like flavor. So we got to keep the almond-like flavor, get rid of the cyanide, and end up with an even sweeter fruit bark than the choke cherries themselves. Raw choke cherries, not super delicious, but dehydrated choke cherries are amazing and delicious. And then you can, of course, rehydrate that dried choke cherry bark and make choke cherry pudding, or you can blend it with dried meat and tallow, and you can have pemmican and things like that. So I think this is just an example of yes, but there's also indigenous knowledge that made this sweeter, completely food safe, and much more easily able to be utilized as a gift from the earth rather than something that we needed to be more warned about. Interestingly enough, those little stems of the choke cherries can also be put into roasts, like like a elk roast or something, like you'd put cloves in a ham to infuse it with the flavor as it's cooking. You can do the same thing with chokecherry twigs, which is interesting. So there is, of course, hydrocyanic acid in the leaves and stems of this plant as well, but that roasting process, or you can dehydrate the stems first to neutralize that and then use them as a seasoning. So boiling or roasting, or sorry, boiling or dehydration will neutralize that hydrocyanic acid. So fun facts, lots of cool things happening with seasonings. And also don't be concerned about me saying, oh no, hydrocyanic acid, there's cyanide, because apple seeds have cyanide too. Like this is just a thing that is in some plant seeds. It is not a thing to be concerned about, but it is cool to talk about. And then of course, I always love talking about land management and traditional native methods of cultivating the prairies, even for tribes like my Blackfeet ancestors that were not considered farmers or ranchers. We still had a massive role that we played in the incorporation of our foods and tending to the plants, moving the animals. We weren't hopping on our horses and herding the animals around, but by doing what these men are doing in this old Charlie Russell painting. These are Blackfeet warriors setting fire to the prairies. And by practicing these methods of landscape burns and old burning practices, whether in the spring or the fall, outside of peak drought season, they would very intentionally basically summon the grazing animals to that location. There's now peer-reviewed research, separate studies that have been collected that show that bison, antelope, elk, deer, bighorn sheep, and moose will all preferably go to prairies that have been burnt within the last year rather than prairies that have not been burnt. So it's not hurting in the pushing sense, but it is hurting in the pulling sense, because you end up with a big blackened patch of prairie. So it warms the soil faster in the springtime, which helps the plants, the perennials, wake up. It germinates the seeds faster in that warm soil. And then you end up with a big green patch of prairie without that leaf litter on top that makes it hard for plants to push through. So it gets greener faster, it grows stronger, and it also gets rid of a lot of those shrubby, rose hips or wild roses, shrubby cinquefoil, sagebrush that will take over a prairie if it has not been burnt for a long period of time. So it keeps the grasslands really healthy for the grazing animals that eat those grasses. So there's a number of different things going on. And also, there's certain plant species, because they co-evolved with people burning the prairies, that need a low intensity fire in order for their seeds to germinate. And a prime example of that is our prairie turnip. For Lakota people, they called it timsila. For Blackfeet people, we call it moss, M-A''S. And it relies on a low intensity prairie fire to break that seed coat so that that seed is able to germinate. If you don't have a prairie fire, it needs a lot of freeze thaw cycles in order to break that seed coat so it can germinate. So just some different things that happen in that space. And then there's a lot of other cool work that's being done to restore indigenous food systems. This is the Blackfeet buffalo herd. We have about 800 animals. A lot of these are actually beefalo. They've been mixed with beef, or their ancestors have been mixed with cattle over time, and we end up with beefalo. But as I mentioned before, they do great things for the landscape. And then we also get to process them and incorporate them into our own food supply systems. So Blackfeet's in the process of building our own meat processing facility on our reservation. Right now, the meat is processed off reservation and then brought back and sold at our tribal grocery store and other tribal institutions. But then there's also things that are connected to food systems as well. So we build beaver dam analogs, which is essentially a man-made beaver dam situation, like you see in the picture. And that helps create the wetlands that are so essential to the overall ecosystem health. Our grazing animals need these reservoirs of water into the summer months so that they have places to drink. We have these natural fire breaks. And in the absence of beavers, or beavers as they return to the land, don't have an opportunity to build all the wetlands that we need in order to keep our ecosystems healthy. So sometimes people will go in and build them, and then beavers will come back later and repair the whole system. So they're like, that's not how you do it. You guys did it wrong. So they might come in and do some patchwork, and it helps establish good habitats for them as well. So hold on 1 second. I had a spinning spiral of death, and I want to make sure my computer's not trying to die. It is. Hold on. I'm going to plug it in real fast.
Also, I just wanted to share a really quick research video while doing that. Kids Gardening has an entire course on teaching culturally relevant food systems for many different cultures. I'm gonna drop it in the chat shortly, but um sharing some resources from partners. So be on the lookout for that, everybody.
Cool. So
And
these are just
maybe,
some, oh, sorry.
very happy to hear Halloween in the summer, in the spring.
You know, I'm all about incorporating Halloween in all things. It's all spooky. No. So these are just some other pictures of some work that's being done just to reconnect people with food systems. So this is our Blackfeet bison over here on the left. Cheyenne River has a very similar thing. So they incorporate a lot of buffalo meat into their tribal schools that are on the reservation. And then there's other projects that are happening. Food Access and Sustainability Team, FAST Blackfeet, has built some garden beds where they teach people how to raise native plants that Blackfeet people have used for teas. So those are things like yarrow, bee balm, or wild bergamot, mint, raspberry leaves, elderberries, and sage. And so they incorporate some of these things, teach people how to grow them, harvest them, dry them, and then they'll package them up into little tea blends that get distributed through a local food pantry. So people are getting cool native grown tea blends that people are also able to go and wild harvest rather than like expired Coca-Cola through the food pantry. So there's some cool stuff happening there. And then of course there's everything from wild onions to different root vegetables that people are able to harvest as well. And so they try incorporating a lot of that knowledge into the gardening lessons that they're giving to folks as well. Now, these garden beds have been planted with vegetables as well. And so some people are growing vegetables, some people are growing teas, some people do both. And then they're able to distribute those through the food pantry, which is really awesome. But along the way, a lot of people are learning important gardening and plant identification skills too. So this is what I get to do. I get to teach people lessons about Indigenous foods and incorporate some of these great stories. This was a whole nixtamalization class that I did in Vermont where we made blue corn and we made arepas at the end of it, with little pulled bison sandwiches that we use the arepas for. We made elderberry barbecue sauce, things like that. So I get to do really fun work and teach classes like this. So a lot of these recipes that are depicted on this page are also available on my website. There's blue corn crusted lake trout with lamb's quarter pesto. This is choke cherry braised rabbit with candied pecans and on cornbread. And there is pumpkin seed peanut butter cookies sweetened with maple sugar. And then sunflower butter caramel popcorn. So all good things. Some of them bougier than others, but also very accessible. I mean, sunflower butter popcorn is easy enough to make in a classroom, and to be able to talk about maple syrup and where maple comes from, to be able to talk about corn and popcorn as one of the original snacking foods of the continent. And then, of course, sunflower butter, if you use that instead of peanut butter, a lot of classrooms and schools will allow you to use that because you're not necessarily allowed to use peanuts in a lot of classrooms, or tree nuts as well. So sunflower butter kind of gets away from that. And then, of course, there's a couple resources for folks as well. I recently did a kids cookbook. This is available on my website. It has a lot of kid-friendly recipes from utilizing foods from across North America. But I also wrote a toolkit for food service directors to incorporate more native foods into their school meal programs, whether that be in breakfast or lunch programs. And this toolkit is available for free on my website at IndigiKitchen.com. So you can scroll to the bottom and you have access to a whole toolkit with curriculum ideas. There's actually a profile on Hardin School that I know will be the next school or the next resource that's profiled in this series. And there's 2-week cycle menus in there. And then it goes through the crediting of how do you credit certain indigenous foods, or like wild rice or bison meat, or can you use donated wild game in your school lunchroom? You actually can. There's certain provisions of how to do that, but there's some cool things that are part of that as well as a resource. So that's available for free on my website, and the cookbook's available for purchase. So I'm trying to get better at self-promotion on that front. I'm not great, but I'm trying. And then this is, of course, the list to the ways to find me. And now we can jump into a whole bunch of questions.
All right, let's give a round of applause to this amazing presentation. Thank you so much, Mariah. Wow, I have several touch points as you were talking. I lived in Peru for a long time, so when the mention of the Andes and their food innovation, if you haven't looked into them, to everybody, please. And then also I've had friends who've eaten sunchokes without really knowing what they were gonna get into. And then going home and everybody being like, oh wow, okay, my stomach is doing things. So we're moving into our Q&A portion of our presentation. So if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. I know we do have one specifically around vegan versions of the recipe. So somebody asked if you have vegan recipes that accommodate Native families who are on WFPB.
Yeah. So you say WFPP?
WFPB, and highly encourage whoever shared that question to, or if you know what it stands for.
I don't know what that is. I did do a series of native recipes utilizing like ingredients off the WIC list, and some of those are on my website. I got to work with the Intertribal Council of Arizona, and we did some of those. So that's a good question. Whole food plant-based. Oh, okay. See, this is I'm like, I don't know. So I don't know specifically what the requirements are of WFPB. I'm not sure.
I think it's just an acronym for I don't think it's a program. I thought it was a program, but
Yeah.
the question actually read who are whole food plant-based.
Okay. See, like I've worked
Yeah.
with Whole30 before, right? And I did a recipe for them. And they have like very specific, like this is allowed, but this is not allowed. So there's certain things like that. So I have some recipes on my website that would fit at least within the plant-based category. I have everything from like pumpkin seed flour brownies, which are made with pumpkin seed flour, cocoa powder, avocado oil, and sweetened with maple syrup. So, there's things like that that would fit, I think, within whole food plant-based, but I'm not sure exactly if that meets the definition. I've also done recipes like I have a sweet potato pumpkin lentil soup, and that is also something that's entirely vegan. So there's a couple things within that. Yeah, lentil pumpkin soup. Okay, I was gonna say I do use a lot of wild game, and that's also partly because where I live, we of course hunt and harvest things from the land, but I do have a lot of recipes that don't have any animal products in them as well. So
Awesome. Thank you so much. I also, yeah, WFPB, now I know what it's not a program, it's just an acronym. There's another question. There's someone in the chat that mentioned that they're Taino, Penobscot, and truly they want to honor the ancestors in their work, their ancestors in their work. So do you know of anyone working with these groups that may be open to collaboration? Or maybe where could someone start finding those groups to collaborate with in any locality?
yeah, I think that there are, I think that there's a lot of food knowledge keepers in any community, right? And so reaching out to, first family members, but asking, who wants to share recipes. If you're coming from those communities, if there's local communities in your region and you want to reach out to them, then it's checking out like who are the knowledge keepers in that system? Like, are there native people that are doing catering? Are there elders that work with plants? Like, is there a way that we can compensate someone to come in and like share their time and talk about plants with us? Maybe that's a plant walk behind the school. I don't know what it might be. But to be able to kind of connect with those resources, I think is really important. But if you're someone that comes from those communities, yeah, reach out to family first. If your family, maybe you have family that lives more connected to those places. If you don't, if you find yourself outside of those communities, sometimes that's challenging. But maybe that family member is like, oh, my friend such and such works with foods or plants or whatever that may be. And then to connect with kind of who they know. It's always like, who do you know? So sometimes like that is the best way that I know to reach out. But it can always, it depends on the certain community. And sometimes it's just hanging out and showing up and, taking the time and, maybe there's a food pantry or something you can volunteer with and start to, just keep showing up and being consistent rather than, and I know that you guys are not tending to approach with this mentality, but people are often suspicious of folks that show up and try to like mine native people for data. And so approaching in ways where you keep showing up and showing like, I'm not just here to pick your brain and then disappear. I'm here because I want to form like this existing relationship where, maybe you have students and those students are going to go help out at the local food pantry and we can connect with some of the nutrition educators there or whatever it might be. But people want to teach and they want to share, but they don't want to feel like they're being used. So I think that is obviously not a black and white situation. So it's just trying to think of how that comes into play.
Yeah, especially the relationship piece goes a really long way. I think this is one question that I think I knew was gonna come up that I feel like a lot of people have when they're talking especially about native cultures or generally cultures that are not their own. So somebody in the chat asked if you could provide any suggestion for teachers and how they can talk about cultural appropriation when introducing native foods, native practices with non-Indigenous students.
Yeah. This is interesting because I was just at a catering event last night and there was a whole bunch of different booths set up. And of course I was doing native foods and sourcing from native vendors and all of that. And I walked around and there was another group that was doing native foods, but they weren't sourcing from native vendors. I think they bought their venison from like New Zealand where they sell venison and they didn't have a native chef. They were just making native inspired foods, which was wild to me. So yes, that is an interesting thing that people are navigating. I think that there's a couple important things that can be done is to one, cite your sources, right? And when you're talking about things from specific places, to share like what tribal nation does that information come from? And yes, there are things like the Three Sisters where that is a broadly applied concept that applies from Haudenosaunee tribes in the Northeast down through like my Cherokee ancestors originally in the Southeast, down through, Navajo Nation in the Southwest, right? Like they're all tribes and peoples across that space utilize Three Sisters knowledge and polyculture planting, but try to at least apply which nation these things are coming from. Where is this information sourced from? Because I think part of the important work that people do is also to reduce the homogenization of Indigenous nations, right? There's over 500 tribal nations. And the more that we can recognize that and help kids recognize that, I think is also very important. And also, if there are knowledge keepers or I'm laughing so hard because Zoom just sent me a pop-up that said, confirm your speaking language. It sounds like you might have switched to a different language. Please update it so we can provide better quality transcription. Yeah, my bad. Uh, you've started speaking Indigenous languages. What are we gonna do? Um, but, but getting distracted now. I think whenever you can cite that, even if it's like, oh, I'm looking at the breeding sweetgrass for kids book, and we're talking about this, or if we're utilizing that as a resource, if we're utilizing somebody's recipes, what tribal nation does that come from? Who wrote that down? Like kind of documenting those things and applying like, here's where we are, like people did at the intro, like, here's the homelands I'm on, right? But we're going to talk about this, and these people actually live over here. So this is not directly applying to our home here, but rather this other place, or whatever that might be, and connecting places to people, to knowledge, to land, I think is really helpful. Just in terms of how we're forming these ideas within a school system. Uh, intro level.
We have a few more minutes. There's another question says, do you have classes for garden educators?
I have a couple of gardening videos on my YouTube channel. I don't do a lot of it, but I've done some things on like composting and pest management and things like that. So
Because it seems like there might be a want, just throwing it out there. If you ever wanted to. So
um I mean, yeah, I mean, I'm always down, and I am a gardener myself, so of course I'm like navigating starting seeds while traveling for work and everything else. So um and I get to navigate fun things like the issues that everyone else has to deal with, like cows breaking in my yard and bears stealing all my carrots and fun things like that. So I get I have fun gardening stories and classes, but also things that are related to that, like food preservation and harvesting and stuff like that. So I have not done a ton of it, but I'd be open to it because that's in my wheelhouse.
Mm, thank you. Yeah. Bears eating carrots. I'm in Washington, D.C., so that I'm like, I would cry. So there's another question. I'm just scanning it really quick, and maybe this is the last one, and then we'll start wrapping up. Um, I have been working with a group of elders and have tried to get more cultural foods incorporated into recipes we make in class. But when I try to ask, they say they're fine with the recipes as they are. Later, they'll tell them that they wish they could have made something else. But the person delivering the class seems that they're like, I don't know what dish they're referring to. Um, and feel like if they tell them what foods are traditional or dishes or what dishes are traditional, it's not their place to explain their culture to them. So they were asking, have you run into a situation like this, or if you have any suggestions for the situation?
Good question. This reminds me, this reminds me of a story that I heard of a non-native teacher bringing in an elder to teach about pemmican. And pemmican is a combination of dried meat, could be from a variety of animals, doesn't really matter. Dried berries, again, doesn't really matter where, what kind of berries, but they're dehydrated, right? And you pound everything into basically a meat and berry powder, and then you use just enough tallow so that it sticks together, right? Because tallow, it's a animal fat, it's solid at room temperature, but it also, I mean, it's glue, it sticks everything together. And if you're doing something that requires a lot of calories, nothing like a little fatty, carby protein patty with an infinite shelf life that will support you in that. But this elder came in and they taught them how to make pemmican with Crisco. And instead of using tallow or using even like lard or something like that, they used Crisco. And I heard about this and I was like, oh my God. And this non-native teacher knew that this was not correct. And that using Crisco, which is like a hydrogenated vegetable oil situation, who even knows what Crisco is at this point, but that's not traditional, right? And it's not really like the thing that you want to promote, but you also don't want to be like, the teacher that is not necessarily from this culture, doesn't want to correct the elder that's come. So sometimes there are things to teach outside of the space when people are actively being brought into the classroom. And yes, that is like a certain amount of crazy like, paternalistic things, but also recognizing that people, I mean, you guys heard my big history lesson at the beginning. Even Indigenous elders can be disconnected from this information too. Like, and I can share stories, and also like I can tell you stories of how we harvest camas and how we cook camas, and other tribes might have totally different ways of doing that. So part of that is also just being open to new information. I would say there are other words besides traditional that you can use when talking about Indigenous foods. Fry bread is a traditional food because it's part of our history, right? It got us through a period of time that would have otherwise meant starvation. It's not an Indigenous food, right? And so when we look at that, you can say, I want to work just with pre-contact foods, foods from this place prior to any colonization. Like, do you have recipes like that you can share with us? So and then you get things like buffalo tongue stews made with root vegetables and things like that. And maybe it's the wrong time of year to harvest some of those root vegetables, but maybe you can incorporate like a store-bought turnip, but you can talk about prairie turnips or something like that and kind of find ways to do that. Maybe you don't have a buffalo tongue, but you have a cow tongue because the store has a cow tongue. I don't know. But you can kind of incorporate these different lessons. Even if you're not necessarily able to get those things, you can still teach about those things. And I would use, pre-contact and Indigenous foods, or pre-1492 foods or something like that. Just so that, because traditional foods can mean a lot of things. Some people is like, yeah, spam, the traditional food, right? So it just be really clear about what you're looking for as resources for students as well.
Awesome. Well, one more time, let's all thank Mariah for this amazing presentation. Thank you again so much. And as we wrap up, folks, just a reminder, now I'm the one sharing the wrong screen. Because Zoom likes to make our life not okay. All right, there we go. So one more time, please give it up for Mariah for this amazing presentation. You will be receiving a survey link in the follow-up, in the email follow-up you will receive on Friday, along with the recording and the resource handout from things that people have shared in the chat, as well as some resources that I was writing down, as well as if Mariah has any other additional resources like the children's book, as well as some recipes that I found on your website as well. So really excited to share that with you all. And again, if you would like to connect with us, please keep up with us at SGSO-Network on Instagram, on social media, as well as facebook.com/SGSO-Network on Facebook. Other great ways to keep up with us, other opportunities, webinars, updates from the network. And lastly, if you have any questions, please feel free to email info@sgsonetwork.org. One more time, thank you all so much. We will catch you hopefully in the next webinar. Thank you again so much, Mariah, and I hope everybody has a great rest of their afternoon.